Alara had been married for 7 long years, and in all that time her belly had never grown round with child. Every month brought the same disappointment, the same whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. In her village, women were judged by one thing above all else: their ability to give their husbands sons and daughters. Without children, a woman was seen as incomplete, broken somehow. The other wives in the village would gather at the well each morning, their hands resting proudly on their growing bellies or bouncing babies on their hips. They spoke of morning sickness and sleepless nights with tired smiles, complaints that sounded like bragging to Alara's ears. She would fetch her water quickly and hurry home, avoiding their pitying glances and hushed conversations. Her husband, once kind and patient, had grown cold over the years. Where he used to hold her hand during evening walks, now he barely looked at her during meals. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing season. She caught him watching other men's children with longing in his eyes, and she knew what he was thinking. What good was a wife who couldn't give him a family? The village elders made their decision on a gray autumn morning. 7 years was long enough, they declared. Clearly she was barren, cursed by bad luck or bad deeds. Her husband needed a chance to find a new wife, one who could give him the children he deserved. The tradition was old and cruel, but it was their way. A childless wife after 7 years could be sent away, leaving her husband free to remarry. She packed her few belongings into a small cloth bundle, a spare dress, her mother's wooden comb, and the little money she had saved from selling vegetables at market. Her husband wouldn't meet her eyes as she prepared to leave. The neighbors came out of their houses to watch, some shaking their heads sadly, others whispering that this was what happened to women who couldn't fulfill their most basic duty. The road leading out of the village was dusty and cracked from the dry season. Each step took her further from everything she had ever known: the house where she had lived as a wife, the market where she had sold her small crops, the temple where she had prayed countless times for a child. Behind her, the village grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. As she walked, the weight of failure pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She had done everything right, prayed daily, ate the herbs the wise women recommended, visited every shrine for miles around. Yet her body had betrayed her, refusing to do the one thing that would have secured her place in the world. The tears came slowly at first, then in great sobs that shook her entire body. The sun was setting when she finally stopped walking, her feet bloody and her legs shaking from exhaustion. She found a large rock beside the road and sat down heavily, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The evening air was getting cold and she had nowhere to sleep. No roof over her head for the first time in her adult life. Other travelers passed by occasionally, merchants with loaded carts, farmers heading home from distant fields, young men seeking work in other villages. Some glanced at her with curiosity or concern, but none stopped. A woman alone on the road was either dangerous or unfortunate, and most people preferred not to get involved either way. As darkness fell completely, wild animals began calling from the forests that lined the road. She had never spent a night outside the safety of village walls, and every sound made her heart race with fear. The stars above seemed cold and distant, offering no comfort to a woman who had lost everything. She thought about her childhood, when her mother used to braid her hair and tell her stories of brave princesses and happy endings. Her mother had died believing that her daughter would find joy in marriage and motherhood, never knowing that some women were destined for different kinds of sorrow. The night was long and cold, filled with tears and regrets. She dozed fitfully against the rock, waking often to the sound of owls or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Each time she woke, reality hit her again like a physical blow. She was alone, homeless, and marked as a failure by everyone she had ever known. When the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, she stood up on unsteady legs and began walking again. She had no destination, no plan, only the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay a place where a childless woman might find a reason to keep living. The road stretched endlessly before her, leading toward a future she couldn't imagine. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she had no food and no money to buy any. The small amount of coins in her bundle wouldn't last long, and she had no skills that would help her survive in the wider world. In the village, she had grown vegetables and helped with harvest time, but those were things you did when you had land and community. Out here, she was just another homeless wanderer. The second day of walking was harder than the first. Her feet, already sore from the previous day's journey, developed painful blisters that made every step agony. The sun beat down mercilessly and she had no hat or parasol for protection. Her water ran out before midday, and her lips began to crack from thirst. By evening she was stumbling more than walking, her vision blurry from exhaustion and dehydration. She had passed through 2 small villages during the day but hadn't dared to stop and beg for help. The shame of her situation felt too heavy to share with strangers, and she feared they would drive her away just as her own people had done. As night fell again, she knew she couldn't walk much further. Her legs were shaking and her head felt light and strange. She found another roadside rock and collapsed beside it, too tired even to cry anymore. The sounds of the night seemed louder and more threatening than before. But she was too weak to be properly afraid. This was how she would die, she realized, alone on a dusty road, forgotten by everyone who had ever known her. The village would speak of her for a few weeks, then find new gossip to occupy their attention. Her husband would remarry within the year, probably to some young girl who would quickly give him the sons Alara never could. The stars wheeled overhead as she drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally giving up the fight to stay awake and alert. Tomorrow would bring either rescue or the end of her story, but tonight, she was beyond caring which it would be. When Alara opened her eyes, she thought she might be dead. The world around her was dim and unfamiliar, nothing like the harsh roadside where she had collapsed. She was lying on something soft, a real bed with clean blankets, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something cooking that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. A deep voice spoke from somewhere nearby, gentle and concerned. "You're awake. That's good. I was starting to worry about you." She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff and painful from her ordeal. A man sat on a simple wooden stool beside the bed, watching her with kind eyes that held no judgment or pity. He was older than her husband had been, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. Most striking were the scars, a long one across his left cheek, smaller ones on his hands and arms, marks that told stories of battles fought and survived. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely working after days without water. "My camp," he replied simply. "I found you by the mountain pass, unconscious and burning with fever. You've been sleeping for 2 days." He reached for a water skin beside his chair and held it out to her. "Drink slowly. Your body needs time to remember how." The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down, but he gently pulled the skin away when she tried to drink too fast. "Easy," he said with a small smile. "It will make you sick if you rush." As her mind cleared, she began to take in more details. She was in a large tent made of sturdy canvas, furnished with simple but well-made items. The bed she lay on, a small table, several wooden chests, weapons hanging from tent poles. Everything was clean and organized, the home of someone who lived a disciplined life. "I should go," she said, struggling to sit up despite her weakness. "I don't want to be a burden to you. I have nothing to repay your kindness." The man held up a calloused hand to stop her. "My name is Thane. I'm a soldier, or was until recently, and you're not going anywhere until you're strong enough to travel safely." His tone was firm but not unkind. "Besides, I don't get much company up here. It's nice to have someone to talk to." Over the next few days, as her strength slowly returned, Alara learned more about her rescuer. Commander Thane had served in the northern campaigns for over 20 years, fighting against raiders who threatened the border settlements. He spoke little of the battles themselves, but she could see the weight they carried in his eyes. The wars were over now, at least for the time being, and he was traveling home to lands he hadn't seen in years. He cared for her with the same methodical efficiency he probably brought to everything else. He made sure she ate small portions of simple food, broth and bread at first, then adding vegetables and meat as her stomach grew stronger. He changed the bandages on her torn feet without comment, his touch professional and respectful. When fever made her delirious during the second night, he stayed beside her bed, cooling her forehead with damp cloth and making sure she drank water whenever she woke. Unlike everyone in her village, Thane never asked why she was alone on the road. He seemed to understand that people only ended up in such desperate situations when they had nowhere else to go. When she finally told him her story on the 4th day, speaking quietly as they shared an evening meal, he listened without interruption. 7 years, he said thoughtfully when she finished. That's a long time to carry such weight. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. In my experience, the things we think define us often matter less than we believe they do. She looked at him in surprise. In her world, childlessness was the ultimate failure for a woman, as shameful as cowardice was for a man. But without children, what purpose does a woman have? Thane was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. I've seen women run entire households while their husbands were at war. I've seen them nurse wounded soldiers back to health, negotiate with merchants, teach children to read and write. I've seen them show courage that would humble most men. He met her gaze directly. Maybe your village was too small to see all the ways a person can matter. His words stirred something in her chest, a tiny spark of hope she had thought was completely dead. Could it be possible that her worth wasn't tied only to her ability to bear children? The idea felt revolutionary, almost dangerous to consider. As they traveled together over the following days, for Thane refused to let her continue alone until she reached some safe destination, she began to see herself through his eyes. When she spotted edible plants by the roadside, he praised her knowledge. When she mended a tear in his traveling pack, he thanked her for her skill with needle and thread. When she suggested a better way to arrange their camp to take advantage of the morning sun, he followed her advice without question. You notice things, he told her one evening as they made camp beside a clear stream. Most people walk through the world half blind, but you see what others miss. That's a rare gift. She had never thought of her careful observation as a gift before. In her village, it was just something women did. Notice when the bread was running low. See when a child was coming down with fever. Remember which crops grew best in which soil. Here, traveling with this quiet soldier, her small skills seemed suddenly valuable. Thane was easy to travel with, never complaining about the pace or the simple food they shared. He told her stories of places he had seen during his years of service. Cities with buildings taller than trees, markets that sold goods from distant lands, mountains that touched the clouds. His world was so much larger than hers had been, and listening to him expanded something inside her chest. But it was the way he treated her that truly began to heal the wounds in her heart. He asked her opinion on which path to take when they reached crossroads. He shared his food without making her feel like a charity case. When rain forced them to take shelter under a rocky overhang, he gave her his dry cloak without being asked. These small kindnesses, offered without expectation or fanfare, meant more than grand gestures would have. On their 6th day together, they reached a crossroads where their paths would separate. Thane was heading west to his family lands, while the road south would take her toward the larger towns where she might find work as a servant or seamstress. They both knew this was where they would part ways, but neither seemed eager to say goodbye. You could come with me, Thane said suddenly as they stood looking at the signpost. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. I mean, if you wanted to. I have a large house and lands to manage. I could use someone with your practical skills. She stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You would trust me with such responsibility? A woman you found half dead by the roadside? He smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face. I've learned to judge people by their actions, not their circumstances. In 6 days of travel, you've proven yourself to be honest, capable, and good company. That's more than I can say for most of the people I've known. Standing at that crossroads, with the afternoon sun warming her face and this kind man offering her a chance at a new life, Elara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since her exile began, she felt wanted not for what she could give or produce, but simply for who she was. The journey to Thane's lands took another week, and with each mile they traveled together, Elara felt herself changing. The fearful, shame-filled woman who had been cast out from her village was slowly being replaced by someone she barely recognized. Someone who could laugh at Thane's dry jokes, who could suggest better routes through difficult terrain, who could sit by the evening fire without constantly apologizing for taking up space. When they finally crested the hill that looked down into Thane's valley, Elara gasped at the sight. Rolling green fields stretched as far as she could see, dotted with grazing sheep and crossed by a crystal-clear river. The house itself was larger than anything in her old village. Not a mansion, but a solid stone building that spoke of prosperity earned through honest work. Fruit trees grew in neat rows near the house, and she could see vegetable gardens that were clearly well tended despite their owner's long absence. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Thane's face lit up with quiet pride. "My grandfather built the house," he explained as they made their way down the winding path. "3 generations of my family have worked this land. Every stone wall, every planted field represents someone's sweat and dreams." As they approached the house, several people emerged to greet them: an elderly man who served as caretaker, a woman who managed the household, and a few field workers who had stayed loyal despite their master's long absence. They welcomed Thane home with obvious joy and genuine affection, and they accepted Alara's presence without question when he briefly explained that she would be helping with the management of the estate. That first evening, as they sat in Thane's comfortable main room with a proper fire crackling in the stone hearth, the weight of the day seemed to settle heavily on his shoulders. He stared into the flames for a long time before speaking. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, his voice unusually serious, "about why I really asked you to come here with me." Alara set down the cup of warm cider she had been sipping and waited, her heart suddenly beating faster. Had she misunderstood his kindness? Was there some expectation or debt she didn't know about? Thane was quiet for so long that she wondered if he had changed his mind about speaking. When he finally continued, his words came slowly, as if each one was difficult to say. "I'm the last of my line," he began. "My father died while I was away at war. My 2 brothers fell in different battles years ago. There are no cousins, no distant relatives who could inherit this place when I'm gone." He gestured around the room, taking in the comfortable furniture and family portraits on the walls. "All of this, the house, the lands, the people who depend on them for their living, will die with me unless I find a way to pass it on." She began to understand where this conversation was heading, and her chest tightened with familiar dread. Here it was again, the expectation that she provide children, the weight of carrying on a family line. But Thane surprised her. "The thing is," he continued, still staring into the fire, "I don't think I can father children. 20 years of war, injuries, diseases. My body isn't what it once was. The healers have told me that men who have been through what I've experienced often find themselves unable to sire sons and daughters." He turned to look at her directly then, his scarred face serious, but not unkind. "We're both marked as broken by the world's standards. You for not bearing children, me for probably not being able to father them. But maybe 2 broken people can create something whole together." Alara felt her breath catch. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife," he said simply. "Not because either of us has anywhere else to go, and not because we're desperate, but because in these past weeks I've seen the kind of person you are. You're intelligent, capable, and kind. You understand hard work and appreciate simple pleasures. You don't demand things I can't give, and you don't make me feel less of a man because of my scars and limitations." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I can't promise you children. That may not be possible for either of us. But I can promise you respect, security, and a true partnership. You would be mistress of this house with authority over the household and lands. Your opinions would matter, your skills would be valued, and your place here would never be questioned." The proposal was unlike anything she had imagined marriage could be. In her village, wives were expected to be grateful for whatever their husbands provided, to submit without question, to measure their success only by the children they produced. What Thane was offering sounded more like the business partnerships she had seen between merchants: mutual benefit, shared responsibility, respect for each other's contributions. But what if people talk? She asked. What if they say we're both cursed, that our marriage is doomed because neither of us can have children? Thane smiled grimly. People will always talk. In my experience, the ones who gossip the most are usually the ones doing the least with their own lives. Let them whisper. We'll be too busy building something worthwhile to care what they say. She looked around the comfortable room, thinking of the beautiful valley outside, the people who had welcomed her without judgment, the man sitting across from her who saw her as a whole person rather than a failed vessel for children. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. You said this would be a true partnership, she said carefully. What would that mean exactly? It means your voice carries the same weight as mine in decisions about the household and lands, he replied. It means you keep your own counsel and speak your mind freely. It means if you learn skills I lack, I learn from you, and if I know things you don't, I teach you. It means we face whatever comes, good or bad, as equals. The idea was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. In her first marriage, she had been expected to serve and obey, to make herself small and agreeable. The possibility of being truly seen and heard, of having her thoughts and opinions matter, felt almost too wonderful to believe. "And if we never have children?" she asked. "If the whole point of marriage, continuing your family line, can't be fulfilled?" Thane was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then we'll find other ways to leave our mark on the world. We'll make this land more prosperous, treat the people who work for us fairly, maybe take in orphan children who need homes. There are many ways to create a legacy besides blood." As she sat in that warm, comfortable room, looking at this battle-scarred man who offered her partnership instead of pity, respect instead of rescue, Ilara felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to sunlight. For the first time in her adult life, someone was asking her to be herself, not a smaller, quieter, more apologetic version of herself, but exactly who she was, with all her strengths and supposed failures. "Yes," she said quietly, the word coming out before she had consciously decided to speak it. "Yes, I would like that very much." Thane's smile transformed his face, erasing years of weariness and replacing it with something that looked remarkably like joy. "Then we'll make it work," he said simply. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the village chapel with only a handful of witnesses: the priest, Thane's household staff, and a few neighbors who had known his family for generations. Ilara wore a dress borrowed from the housekeeper, simple but clean, and carried wildflowers picked from the meadow that morning. There were no grand celebrations or expensive gifts, but there was something more valuable: genuine warmth from people who welcomed her not because she was beautiful or wealthy, but because Thane had chosen her. The early weeks of marriage were unlike anything she had experienced before. Instead of being shown to separate women's quarters, she was given a tour of the entire house and lands, with Thane explaining how everything worked and asking for her thoughts on improvements that could be made. When she suggested changes to the kitchen layout to make cooking more efficient, he immediately arranged for the work to be done. When she noticed that the vegetable garden could produce more if certain plants were relocated, he asked her to oversee the reorganization. Most surprising was how he included her in decisions that her first husband would never have discussed with her. When a neighboring farmer wanted to buy some of their sheep, Thane asked her opinion on the price. When choosing which fields to plant with what crops, he wanted to hear her thoughts on market demand and soil conditions. When hired workers needed to be disciplined for lazy habits, he asked her to help decide on fair consequences. "You have good instincts about people," he told her one evening after they had resolved a dispute between two field hands. "You see things I miss. The way someone's eyes shift when they're not telling the whole truth. How hard someone is really working when they think no one is watching." This was a revelation to Ilara. In her old village, her observations about people had been dismissed as women's gossip. Here, Thane treated her insights as valuable information that helped him make better decisions. She found herself paying even closer attention to the small details of how people behaved, knowing that her husband truly wanted to hear what she discovered. The physical aspects of their marriage developed slowly and naturally. Thane never pressured her or demanded his rights as a husband. Instead, he seemed content to let trust build gradually between them. They started by sharing meals and evening conversations, talking about everything from farming techniques to stories of places they had lived. He told her about battles he had fought, not boasting about victories, but sharing the weight of difficult decisions and losses that still haunted him. She began to tell him things she had never shared with anyone: her childhood dreams of traveling to distant cities, her love of reading the few books that came through her village, her secret attempts to write poetry during long winter evenings. Instead of dismissing these interests as silly or inappropriate for a woman, he encouraged them. He had books in his house, more than she had ever seen in one place, and he invited her to read any that interested her. "My mother was educated," he explained when she marveled at the small library. "She taught me that knowledge makes people better, regardless of whether they're men or women. I never understood why some people try to keep their wives ignorant. Wouldn't you want your partner to be as intelligent and capable as possible?" Their first real argument came about 2 months after the wedding, when a merchant tried to cheat them on a grain sale. Ilara had noticed discrepancies in the weights and measures, but when she tried to point them out, The merchant dismissed her concerns and spoke only to Thane. She felt her old habits returning, the urge to stay quiet, to avoid making trouble, to let the men handle important matters. But Thane surprised her by turning to the merchant with ice in his voice. "My wife knows more about grain quality than most farmers I've met. If she says there's a problem with your measurements, then we need to resolve it before any money changes hands." The merchant, faced with Thane's military bearing and complete support of his wife's judgment, quickly agreed to correct the discrepancies. Later, as they walked home together, Alara felt overwhelmed by gratitude and something deeper, the beginning of real love for this man who saw her as an equal partner. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "You could have just accepted his original offer to keep peace." Thane stopped walking and turned to face her. "If I don't trust your judgment, why would I have married you? If I don't support you in public, why would you trust me in private? We're partners, remember? That means I have your back, just as I know you have mine." As autumn turned to winter, their relationship deepened in ways that had nothing to do with the original practical reasons for their marriage. They developed routines and inside jokes, shared preferences and small traditions. Alara discovered that Thane had a dry sense of humor that matched her own, and that he genuinely enjoyed her company during the long evening hours when the day's work was done. She also learned that he had nightmares sometimes, not surprising for a man who had seen 20 years of warfare. When he woke gasping and disoriented, she learned to speak softly and touch him gently until he remembered where he was. He never talked about what he saw in those dreams, but he seemed grateful for her calm presence beside him. In return, he helped her work through her own fears and insecurities. When she caught herself apologizing for taking up space or expressing opinions, he would gently remind her that she belonged here, that her thoughts mattered, that she didn't need to make herself small to be acceptable. "You do that thing again," he said one evening when she had automatically apologized for disagreeing with his suggestion about rearranging the storage shed. "You act like having different ideas is something to be sorry for. Why do you think I married you? To have someone who agrees with everything I say. I can get that from paid servants." Slowly, she began to believe that he really did value her mind as much as her domestic skills. When traveling merchants visited their land, he made sure to introduce her as his wife and partner, not just as the woman who managed his household. When neighbors came calling, he included her in conversations about crops and weather and local politics, treating her contributions as valuable as any man's. The changes in her were noticed by others as well. The village women who had initially been curious about Thane's unusual choice of wife began to speak of her with respect. She had opinions about everything from the best time to plant certain vegetables to the fairest way to resolve disputes between neighbors, and people started coming to her for advice. "You're different now," observed the woman who helped with the laundry, someone who had known Alara since her arrival. "You stand straighter, speak louder. You look like a woman who knows her own worth." That observation stayed with Alara as she went about her daily tasks. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she saw that it was true. The frightened, apologetic woman who had been cast out from her old village was disappearing, replaced by someone confident and capable. She moved through her days with purpose, secure in the knowledge that her husband valued her contributions and that her place in this household was unshakable. But perhaps the most important change was the growing warmth between her and Thane. What had begun as mutual respect and practical partnership was becoming something deeper. She caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the careful way he treated the animals and the patient manner in which he taught inexperienced workers. She looked forward to their evening conversations, treasured the moments when his rare smiles transformed his scarred face. One snowy evening in late December, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple dinner, she realized that she had fallen in love with her husband. Not the desperate, needy love she had felt in her youth, but something steadier and more valuable. This was love built on trust and respect, on shared work and shared dreams, on the daily choice to be kind to each other even when it would be easier not to be. When she told him this, speaking quietly into the comfortable silence between them, his response was everything she could have hoped for. "I love you too," he said simply. "Not because I needed a wife and not because you were convenient, but because you're the best person I know, and every day with you makes me want to be better than I was the day before." Spring brought changes to both the land and to Ilara's heart. As the fields turned green and the fruit trees burst into bloom, she found herself laughing more than she had in years. The sound surprised her sometimes, genuine, unguarded laughter that bubbled up naturally during conversations with Thane or while working alongside him in the gardens. Their physical relationship had grown as naturally as the spring flowers. What began with respectful distance had evolved into comfortable closeness, hands that lingered when passing tools, shoulders that touched while reading together in the evenings, gentle kisses goodnight that gradually became something warmer and more passionate. Unlike her first marriage, where intimacy had been tainted by the desperate pressure to conceive, with Thane it was simply an expression of their growing love. "I never expected this," she told him one morning as they walked through the orchard, checking the progress of the young fruit. Her hand was tucked into his arm, a gesture that had become natural over the winter months. "Expected what?" he asked, though his smile suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "To be happy," she said simply. "To wake up each morning looking forward to the day ahead. To feel like I belong somewhere, like I have something valuable to contribute." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his weathered hands gentle on her face. "You were always worthy of happiness. Your old village was just too blind to see what they had." The compliment made her flush with pleasure, but also with a confidence she was still learning to accept. These days, when Thane praised her intelligence or her skills, she didn't immediately deflect or apologize. She was beginning to believe that maybe he was right, that maybe she really was capable and valuable in her own right. Their partnership had evolved beyond the practical arrangements of their early marriage. Now they worked together with the easy rhythm of people who understood each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. When a difficult negotiation arose with grain merchants, Ilara's sharp eye for detail and Thane's reputation for fairness combined to secure better prices than either could have achieved alone. "You're wasted on domestic work," Thane told her after she successfully resolved a complex dispute between neighboring farmers over water rights. "You should have been born to a merchant family or trained as a judge. You see through to the heart of problems faster than most men I've known." The idea that she might have been suited for traditionally male occupations would have scandalized her old community. But here it felt like a natural observation. Thane regularly asked her opinion on matters that other husbands would consider purely masculine concerns. Which crops to plant for best profit, how to deal with workers who weren't pulling their weight, whether to lend money to neighbors facing hard times. "I trust your judgment," he said when she questioned whether it was appropriate for her to be involved in such decisions. "You see people clearly without the blind spots that sometimes affect me." Why wouldn't I want that insight when making important choices? Their evenings together became the highlight of each day. After the day's work was finished and the household settled for the night, they would sit by the fire and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, plans for expanding the orchards, ideas for improving the efficiency of the dairy operation, concerns about aging workers who needed lighter duties. But just as often, they talked about books they had read, places they hoped to visit someday, childhood memories that had shaped who they became. Thane told her about growing up as the youngest of 3 brothers, always trying to prove himself worthy of the family name. She shared stories of her mother's quiet wisdom and her father's gentle humor, painting pictures of a childhood that had been happy despite their family's modest circumstances. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one evening as they shared a cup of wine before bed. "Marrying someone like me instead of finding a young woman who could have given you sons right away?" Thane was quiet for so long that she worried she had asked something she shouldn't have. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "I used to think that having sons was the most important thing a man could accomplish," he said. "My father certainly believed that. He was always talking about carrying on the family name, passing down the land to future generations. But you know what I learned during all those years of war?" She shook her head, sensing that this was something important he needed to say. "The men who died in battle, their sons didn't make their deaths any less tragic. The men who survived, their childlessness didn't make their service any less valuable. A man's worth isn't measured by how many children bear his name. It's measured by how he treats the people around him, how he uses the time he's given, whether he makes the world a little better than he found it." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You make me a better man than I was before I met you. You make this land more prosperous, these workers happier. This house a real home instead of just a place to sleep. If that's not a legacy worth having, I don't know what is. His words settled something deep in her heart that had been restless for years. The shame and sense of failure that had followed her from her old village were finally beginning to fade, replaced by a growing understanding of her own worth that had nothing to do with her ability to bear children. As spring turned toward summer, she found herself humming while she worked, singing old songs her mother had taught her while she tended the gardens or oversaw the household. The other women noticed the change in her, commenting on how she glowed with contentment, how her step had become lighter, and her smile more frequent. "Marriage agrees with you," observed the woman who helped with the cooking, someone who had seen many wives come and go in her long life. "You look like a woman who knows she is loved." The observation was more accurate than the speaker could have known. For the first time in her adult life, Alara felt truly loved, not for what she could provide or produce, but simply for who she was. Thane's love wasn't conditional on her bearing children or being perfectly obedient or never expressing disagreement. It was based on respect for her mind, appreciation for her skills, and genuine enjoyment of her company. In return, she discovered that her love for him had grown beyond what she had thought possible. She loved his quiet strength, the way he treated everyone from the youngest field hand to the oldest neighbor with equal respect. She loved his dry humor and his thoughtful silences, his scarred hands that were so gentle with injured animals, and his rare smiles that seemed all the more precious because they were earned rather than automatic. One warm June evening, as they walked through the fields checking on the growing crops, she realized that this was what happiness felt like, not the desperate, grasping emotion she had once mistaken for joy, but something steadier and more sustainable. It was contentment mixed with anticipation, security blended with excitement about future possibilities. "What are you thinking about?" Thane asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "I'm thinking that I never expected to have a life this good," she said honestly. "I spent so many years believing that I was broken, that I had nothing valuable to offer. Now I wake up each morning knowing that I have important work to do, that my opinions matter, that someone loves me exactly as I am." He stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the wheat field with the evening sun painting everything golden around them. When he kissed her, it tasted of contentment and promise, of shared work and shared dreams. "You were never broken," he murmured against her lips. "You were just in the wrong place with people too limited to see what they had. Here you can be exactly who you were meant to be." As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, Alara felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strange path that had led her to this moment. The pain and rejection that had once seemed like the end of her story had actually been the beginning of something far better than she could have imagined. It was late summer when Alara first noticed the changes in her body. At first, she dismissed the signs, the slight queasiness in the mornings, the unusual tenderness, the way certain smells made her stomach turn. After 7 years of hoping and disappointment in her first marriage, she had trained herself not to read meaning into every small shift in how she felt. But when 2 months passed without her monthly bleeding, she could no longer ignore the possibility that had once consumed her thoughts, and now seemed almost too dangerous to consider. She said nothing to Thane at first, afraid that speaking the hope aloud might somehow jinx it, might invite the familiar crushing disappointment that had defined so much of her earlier life. Instead, she watched her body with careful attention, noting each new symptom as it appeared, the exhaustion that made her want to nap in the afternoons, the way her breasts felt fuller and more sensitive, the strange metallic taste that lingered in her mouth no matter what she ate or drank. Each sign felt like a small miracle and a terrifying risk at the same time. When she finally missed her 3rd monthly cycle, she knew she had to acknowledge what was happening. But the years of disappointment had left their mark. She was almost more afraid of being pregnant than she had been of remaining childless. What if something went wrong? What if she lost the baby, as so many women did? What if this hope, too, was destined to end in heartbreak? She chose to tell Thane on a quiet evening in September, when they were sitting together in the garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Her hands shook as she spoke the words she had dreamed of saying for so many years. "I think I'm carrying a child," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thane went very still beside her, his cup of cider forgotten in his hands. For a long moment, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. She nodded, still not quite daring to look at his face. 3 months now. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, but I think it's real this time. When she finally looked at him, she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. His scarred face wore an expression of wonder and disbelief, as if she had just told him that stars were falling from the sky. I thought, he began, then stopped and cleared his throat. The healers said it probably wasn't possible for me. After all the injuries, all the fevers from infected wounds, I had accepted that this would never happen. Maybe the healers were wrong, she said, reaching for his hand. Or maybe some things happen despite what the experts think they know. He lifted their joined hands to his lips and kissed her fingers gently. How do you feel about it? I know this isn't something we were planning for. The question made her pause and really consider her emotions. In her first marriage, the desire for a child had been desperate and consuming, driven as much by the need to prove her worth as by any maternal instinct. This felt completely different, like a gift rather than a requirement, a bonus rather than a necessity. I'm scared, she admitted. After so many years of trying and failing, I keep waiting for something to go wrong. But I'm also happy, excited. It feels like a miracle I never expected to receive. We'll face it together, Thane said firmly. Whatever happens, whatever we need to do to keep you and the baby healthy, we'll manage it. You're not carrying this burden alone. His words helped ease some of the fear that had been building in her chest. In her previous marriage, pregnancy would have been her responsibility and her failure if anything went wrong. Here, with Thane, it felt like something they were experiencing together, a challenge they would meet as partners. Over the following weeks, as news of her pregnancy spread through their small community, Alara was amazed by the response. Instead of the judgmental whispers she remembered from her village, people offered genuine congratulations and practical help. The housekeeper began making special teas to help with her morning sickness. Neighbors brought gifts of baby clothes they had saved from their own children. Even the workers in the fields seemed pleased by the news, treating her with extra gentleness and consideration. They're happy for us, she marveled to Thane one evening after a neighbor had stopped by with a hand-carved wooden toy for the baby. No one is whispering about whether we deserve this, or calculating how long we've been married, or making predictions about whether something will go wrong. That's because they see how we treat each other, Thane replied. They know this baby will be born into a loving home with parents who respect each other. That's what matters to them. As autumn progressed and her condition became more obvious, Alara found herself cautiously beginning to believe that this pregnancy might actually result in a living child. Her body seemed to be handling the changes well, despite her age and previous difficulties. The morning sickness faded after a few weeks, replaced by a healthy appetite and renewed energy. When she felt the first tiny movements inside her like butterfly wings fluttering against the walls of her womb, she wept with joy. Can you feel it? She asked Thane one evening, guiding his large hand to rest on the small swell of her belly. They lay in bed together in the comfortable darkness, her head on his shoulder, their conversation quiet and intimate. He was still for a long moment, concentrating. Then his face lit up with wonder. Is that? Did the baby just move? She nodded, smiling at his expression of amazed delight. The midwife says it's a good sign when they're active like this. It means they're growing strong. They had found an experienced midwife in the next village over, a woman recommended by several neighbors who had delivered dozens of healthy babies over her long career. She examined Alara monthly and pronounced everything to be progressing normally, though she cautioned that first pregnancies at Alara's age required extra care and attention. Rest when you're tired, she instructed during one of her visits. Eat good food regularly, but don't force yourself to eat things that make you sick. Walk every day, but don't overdo heavy work. And most importantly, don't spend time with people who fill you with worry or stress. A peaceful mind helps make a healthy baby. Thane took these instructions seriously, hiring additional help for the household so that Alara could rest more and work less. He accompanied her on her daily walks, matching his longer stride to her slower pace as her belly grew. When she worried about things that might go wrong, he distracted her with plans for the future, how they would arrange the nursery, what they hoped to teach their child, the improvements they wanted to make to the house and lands. Boy or girl, it doesn't matter to me, he told her one snowy December evening as they sat by the fire. her feet propped up on a cushioned stool to help with the swelling that had begun in her ankles. Healthy is all I care about. Healthy baby, healthy wife, that's the only outcome that matters. His words meant more to her than he could know. In her old life, the pressure to produce male heirs had been intense, as if daughters were somehow failures or disappointments. Here, with Thane, she knew that any child they had would be welcomed and cherished regardless of gender. As winter deepened and her due date approached, Ilara found herself marveling at the changes in her life. 2 years ago, she had been a broken woman walking alone on a dusty road, convinced that she had nothing valuable to offer the world. Now she was a cherished wife, a respected member of her community, and soon to be a mother. The transformation felt so complete that sometimes she wondered if her earlier life had been a dream. "Do you think our child will be happy here?" she asked Thane one evening as they prepared for bed, her movements slow and careful as her pregnancy neared its end. "I think any child would be lucky to grow up in a home where both parents love each other and work together as equals," he replied, helping her settle comfortably against the pillows. "We'll teach them to be kind and fair, to work hard and treat people with respect. What more could any parent hope to give their child?" As she drifted off to sleep beside him, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their baby grew strong and healthy, Ilara felt a peace she had never expected to experience. Tomorrow might bring challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who loved her, carrying a child conceived in joy rather than desperation, surrounded by a community that had accepted her as family. The miracle wasn't just the baby growing inside her, she realized. The miracle was the entire life she had built from the ashes of her old disappointments. The pains began on a cold February morning when frost painted intricate patterns on the windows, and the world outside lay buried under fresh snow. Ilara had been restless all night, unable to find a comfortable position as the baby seemed to press against every organ in her body. When the first real contraction gripped her, she knew with absolute certainty that their child was ready to make its entrance into the world. "Thane," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. He woke immediately, a soldier's habit that hadn't left him even after years of peaceful life. "Is it time?" he asked, already throwing back the covers and reaching for his clothes. She nodded, breathing carefully through another wave of pain. "Send word to the midwife, and ask the housekeeper to prepare the birthing room." They had been ready for weeks, clean linen stored in the room they had chosen for the birth, herbs and medicines prepared by the midwife, neighbors on standby to help with whatever might be needed. But now that the moment was actually here, Ilara felt a flutter of nervousness alongside her excitement. The midwife arrived within an hour, her capable hands full of supplies, and her manner reassuringly calm. She examined Ilara and pronounced that everything was progressing normally, though it would likely be many hours before the baby arrived. "First babies take their time," she said with a smile. "This little one wants to make sure everything is perfect before making an appearance." The morning passed in a rhythm of contractions and rest, pain and relief. Thane stayed close by, offering water when she was thirsty, supporting her when she wanted to walk, holding her hand when the contractions were particularly strong. His presence was exactly what she needed, steady, calm, completely focused on helping her through each moment. "I'm scared," she admitted during a brief lull in the afternoon, when the pains had temporarily eased and she could think clearly again. "Scared of what?" he asked, smoothing her hair back from her sweaty forehead. "What if something goes wrong? What if I can't do this? What if—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but he understood. "You're the strongest person I know," he said firmly. "You've already survived so much. Exile from your village, starting over with nothing, building a new life from scratch. If you can do all that, you can certainly bring our child safely into the world." His confidence in her helped steady her nerves. This was just another challenge to face like the others they had overcome together. She had survived the worst period of her life and found happiness beyond her dreams. Surely she could manage this final step. As evening approached, the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. The midwife moved with efficient purpose, checking on Ilara's progress and murmuring encouragement. The housekeeper appeared periodically with warm water and clean cloths, her face glowing with excitement at the prospect of a baby in the house. "I can see the head," the midwife announced sometime after midnight, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Just a few more pushes and you'll be holding your child." The final stage of labor was intense and overwhelming. pain unlike anything Alara had ever experienced. But underneath the physical struggle was a fierce determination. She was so close now, so close to holding the baby she had dreamed of for so many years. Thane's voice guided her through each contraction, his words of encouragement giving her strength when she thought she couldn't continue. And then, with a final tremendous effort, their child slipped into the world. The baby's first cry filled the room, strong, healthy, indignant at being thrust from the warm darkness into bright light and cold air. The midwife worked quickly, cleaning and examining the tiny form while Alara lay back against the pillows, exhausted but exhilarated. "A son," the midwife announced with a broad smile, wrapping the baby in soft blankets. "Perfect in every way. 10 fingers, 10 toes, strong lungs, and a good healthy weight." She placed the baby in Alara's arms, and the world suddenly narrowed to this one precious moment. Her son was beautiful, wrinkled and red from his ordeal but unmistakably perfect. His tiny fist waved in the air as he continued to voice his complaints about the cold world he had entered. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We've been waiting so long to meet you." Thane leaned over them both, his scarred face soft with wonder. When he reached out to touch the baby's cheek with one gentle finger, their son's crying quieted as if he recognized his father's touch. "He's so small," Thane marveled, his voice thick with emotion. "How can something so tiny be so perfect?" The midwife finished her examination and pronounced both mother and baby healthy and strong. "He came into the world fighting," she observed with approval. "That's always a good sign. This one will be a survivor." As dawn broke outside the windows, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the new family settled into their first quiet moments together. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with dark, unfocused eyes as if trying to make sense of this strange new place. "What should we call him?" Thane asked softly. They had discussed names during the long months of waiting, but now that their son was actually here, those conversations seemed abstract and unimportant. Looking down at this specific child, this individual person who was both of them and neither of them, Alara found herself thinking of new beginnings and hope renewed. "What about River?" she suggested. "For the water that runs through our land that brings life to everything it touches." Thane considered this, watching as the baby yawned and settled more comfortably in his mother's arms. "River," he repeated thoughtfully. "I like that. It suggests movement, growth, the ability to find a way around obstacles." Over the following days, as Alara recovered from the birth and learned the rhythms of caring for a newborn, she marveled at how naturally motherhood came to her. After years of wondering if she would ever hold her own child, every aspect of caring for River felt like a gift. The way he rooted for milk when hungry, the soft sounds he made while sleeping, the way his tiny hand would grasp her finger with surprising strength. "You were meant for this," Thane told her one evening as he watched her nursing their son. "Look how content he is with you, how naturally you know what he needs." The observation filled her with quiet pride. In her old village, she had been told that her inability to conceive meant she wasn't truly a woman, that she lacked some essential feminine quality. Now, watching River thrive under her care, she knew that assessment had been cruel and wrong. She was exactly the mother this specific child needed, just as Thane was exactly the father River deserved. Their community welcomed the baby with genuine joy. Neighbors stopped by with gifts and offers of help, their faces lighting up when they saw the healthy, alert infant. The workers on their land seemed to take personal pride in the birth, as if River's arrival validated their choice to serve this household. "He looks like his father," observed the housekeeper, studying the baby's features as he lay sleeping in his cradle. "But he has his mother's intelligent eyes. This one will be smart as well as strong." At night, when River slept between them in the big bed, Alara would lie awake sometimes just watching him breathe. The miracle of his existence never quite lost its power to amaze her. This child, who had been impossible for so many years, who had seemed like an unreachable dream, was real and healthy in theirs. "Thank you," she whispered to Thane one night, thinking he was asleep. "For what?" he murmured back, proving that he too had been lying awake, marveling at their good fortune. "For seeing value in a woman everyone else had written off as useless, for giving me a chance to become who I was meant to be, for creating a home where this little one will grow up knowing he's loved and wanted." Thane reached across the sleeping baby to touch her face gently. "You don't need to thank me for recognizing what was always there. You were never broken, remember? You were just waiting for the right time and place to bloom. Looking down at River, so peaceful in sleep between his parents, Alara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain of her exile, the despair of that dusty road, the gradual healing that had come with Thane's love. It had all led to this perfect moment when their family was complete. She was no longer the woman who had wept beside the road, convinced that she had nothing to offer the world. She was a wife, a mother, a valued member of her community, a woman who knew her own worth. Most importantly, she was exactly who she was meant to be. 5 years had passed since River's birth, and the house that had once been quiet now rang with the laughter and chatter of children. River had been joined by 2 younger siblings, daughter named Dawn and another son they called Stone. The family that had begun as 2 broken people, helping each other heal, had grown into something beautiful and complete. Alara stood in the doorway of the main room, watching Thane teach River the basics of swordplay with a wooden practice blade. At 7 years old, their eldest son was eager to learn everything his father could teach him. But Thane was careful to emphasize that true strength came from protecting others, not from conquest or domination. A warrior's first duty is to those who cannot protect themselves, she heard him say as River attempted a clumsy parry. Anyone can learn to swing a sword, but it takes real courage to use your strength in service of others. Dawn, now 4, sat nearby with her rag doll, watching the lesson with the serious attention she brought to everything that interested her. She had inherited her mother's sharp eye for detail and her father's quiet determination, a combination that promised to serve her well as she grew older. 2-year-old Stone was napping in his cradle, his chubby fists curled peacefully beside his head. The sight filled Alara with a contentment so deep it sometimes took her breath away. This was the life she had never dared to dream of during those dark years when she believed herself to be fundamentally flawed. These children, this home, this partnership with Thane, it was more than she had ever thought possible. "Mother, come watch," River called, noticing her in the doorway. "Father is teaching me the 5 basic positions." She joined them in the courtyard, settling on a wooden bench where she could observe the lesson while keeping an eye on Dawn and listening for any sounds from the baby. This was her favorite time of day, when the work was finished and the family could simply be together, learning and playing and enjoying each other's company. "Your mother knows more about strategy than most trained soldiers," Thane told River as he corrected the boy's stance. "She sees patterns and weaknesses that others miss. If you want to be truly skilled, you need to develop both physical ability and mental sharpness." The comment made Alara smile. Over the years, Thane had never stopped treating her as an equal partner, never stopped valuing her insights and opinions. Even with 3 small children to care for, she remained involved in the important decisions about their lands and business. The respect he showed her in front of the children was teaching them that women could be both nurturing mothers and intelligent advisors. "Will you teach me to read the old books, Mother?" Dawn asked, abandoning her doll to climb onto Alara's lap. "The ones with the pictures of faraway places?" "Of course," Alara replied, smoothing her daughter's dark hair. "Reading opens doors to worlds you've never imagined. Your father and I want all of you to have every advantage we can give you." Education was one area where they had chosen to break with local traditions. Most families in their region educated their sons but left their daughters to learn only domestic skills. Thane and Alara were determined that all their children would be literate and knowledgeable about the world beyond their valley, regardless of gender. As evening settled over their land, they gathered for dinner in the warm kitchen. The table was laden with food from their own gardens and livestock, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from the autumn harvest, milk from their cows, cheese aged in their own cellars. Everything spoke of prosperity earned through hard work and careful management. "Tell us about when you were a soldier, Father," River requested as they shared the meal. This was a favorite topic, though Thane was always careful to emphasize the lessons learned rather than the glory of battle. "War isn't something to seek out," Thane said seriously, "but sometimes good people have to fight to protect what matters most: their families, their communities, their way of life. The important thing is to never forget why you're fighting, and to never become cruel or heartless in the process." These dinner conversations were teaching their children about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for others. They learned about the wider world through their father's stories and their mother's books, but they also learned about kindness, fairness, and the value of treating everyone with respect. After the children were settled for the night, Ilara and Thane walked through their lands as they often did in the evenings. The fields were winter bare but healthy, the orchards pruned and ready for spring's growth, the livestock secure in warm barns. Everything they could see was the result of their joint efforts over the years. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had never met?" Ilara asked as they paused by the fence overlooking their sheep pasture. Thane considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something important. "I think I would have lived a much smaller life," he said finally. "I would have managed these lands adequately, maybe even prospered in a basic way, but I never would have learned to see possibilities I couldn't imagine on my own. You've made me braver and wiser and more generous than I would have been alone." His words warmed her more than any declaration of love could have. This was what their marriage had become, not just romance but true partnership that made both of them better than they could have been separately. "The children are lucky to have you as a father," she said. "They're learning that men can be strong without being cruel, that power should be used to protect rather than dominate. And they're learning from you that women can be intelligent and capable while still being loving mothers," he replied. "Dawn especially. She watches everything you do, how you solve problems and make decisions. She's going to grow up believing she can do anything." They had received word recently from Ilara's old village. Her former husband had remarried, and finally had the sons he had always wanted. The news might have hurt once, but now it only made her grateful for the path that had led her away from that narrow life. Those children would grow up in a world where women were valued only for their ability to produce more children. Her own children were growing up in a world where everyone's talents and contributions mattered. "I used to think that having children was the only way to leave a mark on the world," she said as they walked back toward the house. "Now I realize there are so many other ways to create a legacy." Their legacy was visible everywhere she looked. The workers they employed were treated fairly and paid well, their children educated alongside the sons and daughters of merchants. The land they managed was more productive than it had ever been, supporting not just their own family but providing grain and livestock to surrounding communities. The example they set of partnership and mutual respect was influencing other couples in the region. "River asked me yesterday if all marriages are like ours," Thane said with a smile. He couldn't understand why some of his friends seem afraid of their fathers, or why some mothers never speak up during important conversations. "What did you tell him?" "That every family finds its own way, but that the best families are built on respect and kindness rather than fear and control." He seemed to think that made sense. Standing on their front porch looking out over the valley where their children would grow up, Ilara marveled at how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once been cast out as worthless had become the center of a thriving household, a respected member of her community, and the mother of children who would carry forward the values she and Thane had worked so hard to instill. "You did give life to my legacy," Thane said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Not just River and Dawn and Stone, but everything we've built together. The way we treat people, the choices we make, the example we set, that will ripple forward long after we're gone." Inside the house, she could hear Stone beginning to fuss in his crib, ready for his evening feeding. Dawn was probably reading by candlelight, pushing the boundaries of bedtime as she always did. River would be practicing the sword positions Thane had taught him, serious and determined even in play. This was her legacy, not just the children she had finally been able to bear, but the home she had helped create, the partnership she had built with Thane, the demonstration that two people could choose to love and respect each other as equals. The broken woman who had wept by the roadside had become the architect of a new kind of family, one built on choice rather than duty, on love rather than obligation. As she went inside to tend to Stone and check on the other children, Ilara smiled at the sound of her family settling in for another peaceful night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, not what she could produce. The warrior had been right all those years ago. She had given life to his legacy, but more importantly, she had given life to her own, and that legacy would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by children who had learned that love and respect were the foundations of any life worth living.